Dietary patterns in cardiovascular disease have been studied for over half a century. Most of that research has been observational. The PREDIMED trial, which stands for Prevention con Dieta Mediterránea, was different. It was a randomized controlled trial, the strongest study design available in nutrition science, conducted across multiple centers in Spain between 2003 and 2011. 7,447 adults at high cardiovascular risk were randomly assigned to one of three dietary patterns. At 4.8 years of median follow-up, the trial was stopped early by its safety monitoring board because one group had significantly fewer heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular deaths. Adults following a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil had 31% fewer major cardiovascular events compared to the control group. In this video, what PREDIMED actually tested and found, the nuances and limitations you should understand before drawing conclusions, how 30 years of Mediterranean diet research fits together, and 3 specific, practical steps you can take this week. Quick note before we continue, this is educational content based on published research, not medical advice. Dietary changes that affect cardiovascular risk should be discussed with your physician, particularly if you are taking statins, blood pressure medications, or anticoagulants, as dietary patterns interact with these medications. Now, the study. The Mediterranean diet as a scientific concept emerged from the 7-country study and Selkis's landmark observation in the 1950s and 1960s that populations in Mediterranean countries had substantially lower rates of coronary heart disease than Northern European or American populations, despite similar or higher fat consumption. The distinguishing features of those diets were olive oil as the primary fat, abundant plant foods, legumes, fish as a protein source, moderate red wine, and limited red meat and processed foods. Decades of epidemiological research built on that observation. But observational studies cannot prove causation. PREDIMED was designed to test whether randomly assigning people to a Mediterranean diet pattern would reduce cardiovascular events. Understanding what the Mediterranean diet means quantitatively is important. PREDIMED used a 14-point dietary adherence score developed specifically for the trial. The score assigns 1 point for each of 14 dietary habits, for example, using olive oil as the primary cooking fat, eating 4 or more tablespoons of olive oil per day, eating 3 or more servings of vegetables daily, 2 or more servings of fruit daily, 3 or more servings of legumes per week, 3 or more servings of fish or seafood per week, fewer than 1 serving of commercial baked goods per week, and fewer than 1 serving of red or processed meat per day, among others. A score of 8 or higher was defined as high adherence. This scoring system has been validated and widely used in Mediterranean diet research since the trial. The PREDIMED design. 7,447 participants, ages 55 to 80, were recruited at primary care centers across Spain. All participants were at high cardiovascular risk, defined as either having type 2 diabetes or having at least 3 major cardiovascular risk factors: smoking, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, overweight or obesity, or a family history of premature cardiovascular disease. None had established cardiovascular disease at enrollment. They were randomly assigned to 3 groups: Mediterranean diet supplemented with free extra virgin olive oil, Mediterranean diet supplemented with free mixed nuts, or a low-fat controlled diet with dietary counseling. The provision of free olive oil or nuts in the intervention groups was a design choice made to support adherence. Participants in the olive oil group received approximately 1 liter of extra virgin olive oil per week for their household. Participants in the nuts group received 30 grams per day of walnuts, almonds, and hazelnuts. The control group received advice to reduce dietary fat. All 3 groups received dietary counseling at quarterly sessions. This is an important detail: the control group was also actively supported, meaning the comparison was not Mediterranean diet versus typical Western diet but Mediterranean diet versus actively counseled low-fat diet. The primary endpoint was a composite of major adverse cardiovascular events: non-fatal myocardial infarction, non-fatal stroke, or death from cardiovascular causes. After a median of 4.8 years, the trial was stopped by the Independent Data Monitoring Committee. The Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil group had a hazard ratio of 0.69 for the primary composite endpoint compared to the control group. That is a 31% lower rate of major cardiovascular events. The 95% confidence interval was 0.53 to 0.91. The Mediterranean diet with nuts group had a hazard ratio of 0.72, a 28% lower rate. Both results were statistically significant. Looking at the individual components of the composite endpoint, the reduction in stroke was particularly prominent. In the extra virgin olive oil group, stroke risk was reduced by 39% compared to control. The reduction in myocardial infarction was smaller and did not reach statistical significance in subgroup analysis. The total mortality difference between groups did not reach statistical significance during the trial, likely because the follow-up period was not long enough to power a mortality analysis in a relatively healthy cohort. A broader body of evidence supports PREDIMED's findings. A meta-analysis published by Sophie and colleagues in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2010 synthesized the observational literature and found that higher adherence to a Mediterranean dietary pattern was associated with significantly lower all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease incidence and mortality, cancer incidence, and incidence of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. Each 2-point increase in Mediterranean diet adherence score was associated with approximately 9% lower cardiovascular disease risk across that meta-analysis. This dose-response pattern across observational studies is consistent with the PREDIMED intervention finding. Now for the limitations. PREDIMED has an important methodological history that is worth being transparent about. The original trial results were published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2013. In 2018, the paper was retracted and republished with a corrected analysis. The reason: a post-publication audit identified irregularities in the randomization at some clinical sites, where some participants were enrolled as family units sharing a household and thus sharing the dietary intervention. This violated strict individual randomization. The 2018 republished analysis applied a statistical correction for this. The primary findings were essentially unchanged, the hazard ratios shifted only marginally, and both intervention arms remained statistically significant. The authors handled this disclosure appropriately. A second limitation is the impossibility of dietary blinding. Participants know what they are eating. This creates potential for psychological effects on reported outcomes, and for differences in other health behaviors that correlate with dietary change. The PREDIMED design mitigated this partly by providing the olive oil and nuts for free, which standardized consumption, and by giving all groups active dietary counseling, which reduced the contrast in general health engagement between groups. Third, the PREDIMED population was Spanish, high-risk, aged 55 to 80, recruited at primary care clinics. The baseline dietary pattern was already more Mediterranean than the typical North American or Northern European diet. The control group eating a low-fat diet still consumes substantially more olive oil, vegetables, and legumes than the average American. Whether the same magnitude of benefit would be observed starting from a more westernized dietary baseline is unknown. Fourth, the trial stopped early due to benefit. Early stopping tends to inflate effect estimates in clinical trials, because you are cutting off at a moment when the data favor one arm before regression to the mean can occur. A fifth limitation worth noting: PREDIMED cannot tell us which specific components drove the benefit. Was it the olive oil itself? The polyphenol in olive oil? The increased fish? The reduced processed food? The increased vegetables? The trial tested a dietary pattern, not a single ingredient. Isolating the active component from a complex dietary intervention is not possible within this design. This also means you cannot achieve the benefit by adding olive oil to an otherwise unchanged diet. The pattern matters. 3 practical takeaways. First, identify your current adherence level using the 14-point PREDIMED scoring system. The full questionnaire is available in the supplemental materials of the published trial. Score yourself honestly. Most adults following a typical Western diet score between 4 and 7. Each additional point of adherence was associated with incrementally lower cardiovascular risk in the observational literature. The goal is not perfection at 14 but meaningful movement up from your starting score. 2 or 3 consistent changes may be enough to shift your adherence meaningfully. Second, identify 2 or 3 high-leverage substitutions. In the PREDIMED scoring system, the highest weighted changes are replacing butter or margarine with olive oil as your primary cooking fat, reaching 4 or more tablespoons of olive oil per day, adding a handful of nuts as a daily snack, and reaching 3 or more servings of fish or seafood per week. These are substitutions, not additions, replacing existing fats and protein sources rather than adding calories on top of your current diet. The Mediterranean diet is not a calorie restriction diet. It is a fat quality and food quality substitution. Third, treat legumes as a practical high-priority target. Legumes, specifically lentils, chickpeas, black beans, and white beans, appear 3 times per week as a scoring criterion in PREDIMED. Most adults following a Western diet consume legumes far less frequently. Legumes are inexpensive, shelf-stable, high in fiber, high in plant protein, and associated with favorable effects on LDL cholesterol and glucose regulation in separate lines of evidence. Adding 1 legume-based meal per week, then building from there, is one of the lowest barrier, highest evidence dietary changes available for adults over 55. To summarize, the PREDIMED randomized trial found that a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil was associated with a 31% lower rate of major cardiovascular events over 4.8 years compared to a counseled low-fat diet in high cardiovascular risk adults aged 55 to 80. The findings survived methodological scrutiny and republication in 2018. 30 years of observational evidence is consistent with this result. The 3 practical steps: score your current adherence, identify 2 to 3 substitutions starting with olive oil and fish, and add legumes regularly. This is educational content, not medical advice. Always consult your physician before making significant dietary changes, particularly if you are managing lipids or blood sugar. Free biomarker guide in the description. New evidence reviews every Tuesday and Friday.